Okay, I see these three general forms of humanity 2.0, and in the middle position I put the eugenics position, because the eugenics position is the position that basically takes the human body as it's come about through evolution as the starting point, and in a sense the kinds of manipulations that it does to the body in order to enhance the human being is very much, you might say, within the territory of the genome. Okay, so while there may be enhancements with drugs and things like this, what we're basically we're basically working with the given biological body and extending its natural capacities. And I take that to be a kind of middle of the road position, because on the one hand it accepts the animal character of human beings, that human beings in some essential sense are animals, and that's why what we're messing around with is the genetic makeup and not sticking in cybernetic or things into us. Okay, so the eugenics thing I would keep as quite separate from, let's say, what Kevin Warwick and other people who implant prosthetic devices in themselves do, which is really imagining human in a sense that blurs the animal non-animal distinction. Okay, and that's what I mean by the cybernetic future, is that kind of more cyborg-oriented future where the fact that we have come from biological bodies in evolution is just a starting point, but doesn't necessarily mean that the more we transhumanize, the more biological we're going to be. In fact, we may become less biological, right? And that's what the cybernetic future, in a sense, points toward. On the other side, I talk about the ecological future, and that's a future that basically, you might say, is anti-transhuman, but is post-human. Okay, and in my book, I draw a very strong distinction between trans and post-human, because transhuman has to do with actually amplifying humanly desirable qualities. And that's something that the eugenics position and the cybernetic position have in common. They just do it by somewhat different means, but the goals are somewhat similar. The post-humanist, in a way, is indifferent to the human, right? So typically what a post-humanist will value is life, right? And life is associated with sentience, the capacity for change, development, things like that, but without privileging the distinctive human qualities such as rationality, consciousness, the so-called higher mental functions. Those are, of course, species-specific to us, but they're not necessarily things that are to be valued for themselves. Okay? And this is why I call it the ecological consciousness, because what the ecological position advocates is that human beings need to live to learn as one among many species. It's a very Darwinian position. It basically promotes a kind of biodiversity, that what you want is as many different forms of life to live as possible, but you don't want to necessarily privilege human life forms. Okay? That is a very post-humanist position. It is one that would probably reduce the population of the planet. It is one that you hear a lot with regard to a solution to our environmental problems, including global warming. And I think that position, which I know transhumanists find very unattractive, sometimes it gets put as bioconservative, nevertheless I think is a real position that has to be dealt with in the future as part of Humanity 2.0. Namely that one possible future for humanity is to not emphasize our humanness so much, but rather to blend in more with the rest of nature. That is certainly on the table, and there are a lot of people who support that view, and I think we're foolish if we just dismiss that out of hand, because it too has scientific basis for it. Okay, now, the thing about justice and productivity, all of these concepts that we associate with what it is to have a liberal society, a fair society, equal society, all presuppose a kind of Humanity 1.0 vision of things. And so in a sense, when we talk, so we basically say if we were to, let's say, remove inequalities of wealth by some sort of redistributive taxation, if we were to remove asymmetries of power so that everybody has equal access to the means of political expression, then people would all be able to flourish to the maximum extent, because fundamentally all people are equal, right? And whatever differences there are differences that are caused by barriers that could be removed, and everybody would be equal. I think there's a sense in which a lot of this is a fundamental assumption of a lot of modern political theory. I mean, and the difference between the free market and, let's say, socialism has to do with means. But nevertheless, both of these views. But a free market only works if everybody, as it were, has something to buy and sell, which means there has to be a rough equality among people in terms that we all roughly need each other equally in order to get everything we want. That's what the division of labor was about. And that's capitalism. Socialism, of course, has a much stronger version of the idea. But it presupposes a rough equality among people in terms of their need for each other. Now, with Humanity 2.0, this becomes tougher, because we're talking about creatures that in fact may inhabit quite different ecologies normally, right? So in other words, what it takes to maintain an android, or what it takes to, let's say, maintain an animal that has a certain amount of welfare and rights accorded by society, are not the same things, and they're not necessarily convertible in any kind of easy way. What can the animal do for the android? What can the android do for the animal? Maybe we can come up with ways of doing this. And I think, in a sense, if we want to create a kind of just society on the model of the old liberal societies that Humanity 1.0 was promoting, then we do need to think about this stuff, right? How can we make the animal and the android, mutually recognize each other, find each other of mutual importance and significance, and want to normally interact with it? Because that's going to be the test, you see. And that's the justice issue. And the productivity issue has to do with how do we measure the value of the stuff these different entities do, right? I mean, the thing about capitalism is, of course, you can reduce everything to commodity value and measure it in terms of money, and then put prices on things. Okay? Well, how do you do that with regard to these creatures that, in a way, their products and the way they produce them, the nature of their labor, is really radically different from each other? You see, we've moved very far away from the world of Adam Smith and Karl Marx, both of whom had some very clear notion, that labor is the source of human value and labor is intrinsic to human beings. That kind of really gets, puts under question in this new world we're moving into. But those issues are going to have to be tackled if we want to take seriously the idea that all of these different sorts of Humanity 2.0 entities can live together in a common society in a relatively just and fair way. The moral entrepreneur is a concept that I introduce in my work, and in a way it's meant to sort of signal a sort of a transformation in our ethical horizons. Because one of the things that you might say Humanity 2.0 is very conscious of is this idea that we are a species in transition. And so you might say one of the things, that being the kind of human being that we're born with, as a biological creature, is not necessarily something worth preserving indefinitely in its, quote, natural form. That, I think, is quite common to all the different views that are of Humanity 2.0. So there's a kind of you might say this is where all the different versions of Humanity 2.0 disagree with kind of natural law theory and the Catholic Church and all this kind of stuff. Okay? And so so the ethical horizons then, there's a sense in which we always have to think about the world is always something in the process of transition. And that if we're going to want to strive to, in a way, self-transcend, to go beyond what we've been given biologically, we're going to have to take some risky decisions. We're going to have to, and they won't necessarily all turn out to be right. And I think this is an aspect of transhumanism that I think gets underplayed very much. That before we get to the state where everybody can be brain boosted and enhanced and all of that, there's going to be a lot of trial and error along the way. And some of it is going to be quite massive, especially on the error side. Because when we're talking about things that we haven't done before, there's no reason to think that just because it looks great on paper, and we even have a theory that can explain how it happens, that it's going to work in practice, or that its practice is going to have the consequences that we desire. So we're going to have to live in a world that actually tolerates a lot more error, some of which some people might call even evil when it comes to the kind of radical experimentation and transformations of the body that are going to have to take place. And as it were, moral entrepreneurship is basically about learning from and taking the most advantage from all of those errors and even evil that will be committed in the meantime. And I think, to put the point controversially as possible so people see clearly, when we talk about the regimes that really try to do something very strong transhumanistically on a social level, we think about the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, it seems to me. And I think rightly so, okay, rightly so. And this is where we have to be very clear about this, because it is quite clear that both of these societies, in their rather different ways, had a transhuman future, which would involve radical transformation of the human body and the human body politic. That is to say, the population of who is included and not included and so forth. All of that was very much part of their agenda, and in that respect, they are not different from transhumanists at all, the contemporary ones. What's different, of course, is the politics of the situation. With both the Soviet Union and Nazism, what you had was very authoritarian versions of carrying out this vision. What we have nowadays is actually a world that, at the level of the state, is becoming increasingly deregulated. And so we, in fact, live in a world I've called, in some cases, bioliberal, right? Namely, that there's a lot of individual or small group kind of experimentation, right? That to a certain extent is legal or not legal, depending upon what country you live in. But the intent, the aims of this are pretty much the same, namely a radical transformation of the human being. And as we saw in the case of Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, there were a lot of atrocities committed along the way. And I think one of the problems with our reaction to that fact is that, in a sense, we sort of say, because something is evil, we therefore want to block it out of our collective consciousness and not actually learn from it. And what I mean by learning from it, I don't mean just learning morally from it so we don't do it again, but rather learn what in fact they did do that may have been right, but was done under those extreme conditions that wouldn't have been allowed otherwise. Okay? And I think this is where we really need, and historians are beginning to do this, but it isn't really part of the public agenda, you might say, to actually look in more detail about the nature of experiments that were done when there were very few regulations in terms of how subjects were dealt with, in terms of the nature. Some of the stuff were horrific and did not serve any scientific purpose. I am sure that is the case, because there was a strong kind of mixture of motives that were going on in a lot of the research that was done. But my guess is that there was, in fact, a lot of stuff that we could learn from, and in terms of the actual data that was produced, and in terms of a lot of the conceptions that the scientists had in terms of what was possible for transforming the human being. And so, see, moral entrepreneurship in that respect is the idea of taking advantage of all of these evil things that took place because they took place in a certain kind of sphere of freedom that is not yet possible again, and therefore learn from it, so that in a sense we can increase the knowledge base in terms of what's possible as we move forward into the future. And frankly, I think one of the ways in which we mature as a species is by being able to face our past squarely and be able to say in the same breath that yes, those people did a lot of evil things, but yes, they did a lot of things that we can learn from the standpoint of knowledge that we can take forward in the future. We can say both of those things simultaneously, it seems to me. And if we're really to learn from the past in a way that can advance a kind of rounded transhumanist agenda, we're going to have to be thinking that way, and that's what moral entrepreneurship is about. I mean, I think one of the things that has happened as a result of the atrocities, especially after the Nazi atrocities, is we've got these institutional review boards that are established, especially in university campuses, that put enormous amount of ethical restrictions on the kinds of experiments that people can do, either to themselves or to other people, even with their consent. So in other words, institutional review board guidelines tend to override whatever personal consent. So, for example, I may know that this experiment may go horribly wrong and do terrible things to me, but I actually think this is a kind of interesting hypothesis, and if it turns out to be true, it could be really quite marvelous for people, and so I'm willing to put my life on the line. Now, actually, most institutional review board ethical guidelines would not allow you to do this at the moment, okay? And largely because you would be seen as operating in a state of ignorance because of the amount of uncertainty that's involved in doing the experiment. But see, if we actually impose that kind of ethical standard in place retroactively, we would never have got most of the most striking results in the history of science that we've got. Not only with regard to human beings, right, but also with regard to animals. Okay, because as you know, their institutional review board guidelines extend beyond humans to cover animal welfare as well, and animal rights activists are very strong about maintaining that. But one of the things that it does is it would invalidate almost all of the major medical research that's taken place over the last 150 years. Okay, and so there's an extent to which one of the things that we have to grant is that the progress of science involves what the ethicists call dirty hands. In other words, you cannot do good without doing some bad, okay? And in a sense, that's kind of the price. That's kind of the price. Now, how exactly one pays that price, I think is something up for negotiation, because I'm not saying we should just allow people to experiment on anything, to any extent, but I do think we really radically need to rethink this tendency to put enormous ethical constraints on the conduct of research, even when people are willing to consent to do more adventurous things. Because I think what this does is it hamstrings science, and it basically prevents us from really advancing as a species, even though it is in the name of protecting the species. And so I do believe that, and see, we got to, in a way, in that respect, take on board this idea of moral entrepreneurship. Namely, that even when harm is caused, there is a lot to be learned from it. And so that in a sense, no bad, no evil is ever merely just that. There is always some good that can come from it if we actually learn from it. And so I think that, that's the key point. And I think transhumanism, if it takes itself seriously, has to be committed to that kind of ethical horizon. And so the first item on the agenda, you might say, is to actually make it easier to conduct these more radical experiments. That is one of the things that has to be on the transhumanist agenda from a practical political standpoint. And I think some of the bioethicists who are sympathetic to transhumanism have begun to see their way there. And so we're now hearing discussions, I don't know if you've run across them, but they're very much discussed in this country, about the idea that people, rather than being protected from science, which is the way the ethical guidelines are usually constructed, the idea that people, as it were, may have a right or a duty to participate in science. Okay? In other words, turn the whole legal issue around and saying, well, look, if science is, as it were, the pinnacle of the human condition, then shouldn't everybody be involved in it? Shouldn't people have a right to get involved in it? Right? If it is what makes us human more than anything else that we do, then why are we afraid of it? Why are we stopping people from getting involved in it, even when they consent to do it? It should be the other way around. It should be kind of a duty, or maybe a right. And so sometimes people, let's say, would compare the duty or right to participate in a scientific experiment with, let's say, military duty, right? Where in a sense, you're a citizen of this country. You should be wanting to defend your country in time of war, or you should have the right to defend your country in time of war. Okay? And that's perhaps the way in which, in a sense, what are we in together when we are engaged in a scientific experiment? A collective fight against ignorance that holds us back from being all that we can be. Okay, so there's a war against ignorance, a war against barriers that we are all trying to fight in our collective battle for self-transcendence. And in that respect, we should all be getting involved in scientific experiments, right? And that we should all learn from the consequences of those things. And it's true, just as people die in war, right? They are dying for a good cause. And I would like to say the same with regard to people who participate in scientific experiments. They get harmed and they die, but it is for a good cause. And we need to, as it were, securitize that activity very much like we do with war, where in a sense, if you die in warfare or in service of your country, right, there are pensions and compensations and things of this kind. There's celebration of your life. There are all these things that we have in place to actually valorize what you have in fact done. And I think something similar needs to be done for people who participate in scientific research but end up being harmed in the process. And I think transhumanists really need, if they're going to be putting their money where their mouth is, they need to be committed to this kind of an agenda. That's a very interesting question. And if I may, I want to answer the question, you might say, both ways. In other words, how the future will look at us, and how, if we could time travel to the future, what we will think of them. Okay, I want to do both ways because I think you get some somewhat different answers. I think if you think about the way in which we think about our own past, right? We in the future, we now, right, think about, let's say, what was going on in the Middle Ages or in the ancient times or all of that. I won't go to the prehistoric stuff because I think it's very hard to make judgments about what they did wrong back in the caves. But I think with regard to recorded history, because in a sense the people in the future that you're talking about would also have the recorded history. They would be sufficiently similar to us that they would be able to see what we have done in a relatively clear way, I would suppose, whereas we can't really see so clearly what those cave guys did. But I think with regard to recorded history, what we now say about the past is if there is one thing that was a mistake, was always trusting authority too much. That usually the established authority usually turns out to be a blockage point. That's usually kind of what happens, right? That in a sense, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the ways of moving forward are present much earlier in time from the time they actually get institutionalized. And the question is, well, why don't they get institutionalized sooner? when we're looking at it now from the future, looking at the past? Well, the reason why the future didn't happen sooner was people were blocking it, and the people blocking it were usually people in authority. Okay, and it's a double-edged sword there, because of course they're protecting their own interests, but also there's a genuine sense of uncertainty about the future, and so if you think about, for example, the Catholic Church vis-a-vis Galileo, right? We say, well, why did it take 200 years for the scientific revolution to happen rather than overnight, right? Why didn't Galileo win his case? Well, you say, well, the Catholic Church didn't believe him and they were narrow-minded. But in fact, a lot of what Galileo said was still very uncertain. And it's only with those additional 200 years you see exactly just how right he was. At the same time, the church is also, as the authoritative form of knowledge, is also in the business of protecting the society as a whole. And so that goes back to this issue of the speed at which you can actually make progress will depend in part in your ability to keep the whole society moving together. Okay? And while, if Galileo were right, a few people in the society, those who could read, those who had access to scientific equipment and so forth, they could make very quick advancements. But what would happen to the rest of the population? You see? And see, so this business of authority holding back progress, which is something I think that the future would say about us, that in some sense the authority figures have held us back. How they get identified will be interesting, whether we're talking, because I don't think religion will necessarily be the thing that they will say held us back, but probably certain kinds of prejudices within the scientific community held us back. Kind of the things that are holding, the kinds of things that scientists tend to think about transhumanists today may turn out to in fact be historically quite important in terms of checking the rate at which progress takes place. That would be my view. But part of that has to do with the sense of responsibility that scientists feel for society as it is now. And so why have people experiment on themselves and do all kinds of crazy, risky things when there's a strong chance they may harm themselves and in the process harm science, right? Because if you have a lot of risk-taking taking place, unless you have the proper kind of social and political safeguards in place of the kind I was describing earlier, where people think about participating in scientific experiments like being involved in the military and serving your country, you need to have that kind of mentality first. But if it looks like it's just arbitrary that you're doing these experiments and you're just dying, then that could be a real bad public relations move for science. You don't want to see a lot of people dying in experiments when people don't think of science that way. You see? So you need to change the worldview within which people understand science before the transhumanism gets accepted. And I think that's going to be the issue where the authority figures will hold things back. That's what I imagine the future will say about us, that the scientific establishment moved too cautiously on a lot of stuff because they were concerned about the ethical and political consequences. That's my view. Now, for those of us who, let's say, fancy a transhumanist future now, okay, and look to the future as this kind of better, improved, enhanced world, right? Let's say we are able to transport ourselves to that future, okay? So let's say we go to, I don't know how many centuries, let's say a century or two maybe, let's say it takes a little more time for the singularity to occur than Kurzweil thinks. So we give it a couple of centuries, not just 40 years, but a couple of centuries. I think one of the things that, I think the main impression, and this is also true, I think, if you were to take any person from the past and transport them to the future. The main impression they will have, that's say us, the main impression we will have of this world that we've always wanted is that it's a harsh place. Okay? Because it will probably have many of the things that we in fact are imagining now. But what we are not imagining is the cost. We are not imagining what are the additional consequences that will come on stream as a result of getting this kind of future that we're working toward. And so, we may have those longer lives. We may have those faster brains that can compute all kinds of things. We may be able to have augmented reality plugged into our brains, as it were, like contact lenses to our eyes. All of that may happen. But then what is the cost with regard to how we deal with each other in terms of how we experience the world? My guess is that a person from the day, being in that future world, will see it as quite harsh. That a lot of things that in a sense we used to take for granted as part of our natural humanity will have disappeared. Okay? Very much like, imagine you're a person who in a sense really welcomed the advent of automobiles because you're in the year 1900 and you say, cars. cars, they're great. I can go fast. I can take it. It's a machine. It's not like a horse. That is so unpredictable and so forth. I can do anything I want in this car. This is going to be a great machine. I can't wait till we all have one. We're able to go hundreds of miles per hour on roads and things like this. And of course, within a generation or two, that was happening. But what cost, right? Environmental pollution, right? There's a sense in which your experience of the natural space is really radically changed. You're constantly, behind windows and things like this. I mean, in other words, from the standpoint of somebody living in 1900, being told, you see, all those things we were predicting in 1900 for 1970 did happen. Yes, they did happen, but in the meanwhile, what also happened was a kind of coarsening of experience, at least to the person from 1900. Right? Because they can no longer experience nature in some kind of naked form any longer. It's very highly mediated, right? It's not valued very much. It's being sold off as real estate, right? That, I imagine there will be a similar kind of experience of a person from our time being transported to this utopian that we're imagining. It will seem to be a harsh place, a place that has many advantages, but their price will have been paid. And it will seem a kind of harsh, coarse place. And it'll be interesting to see whether if we do get what we wish for, we were able to see it, whether we would really want to live in that kind of world. I think that's an open question.